Hey all, happy Juneteenth. It is now a federal holiday. So enjoy your time off. Just wanted to do a brief primer on the meaning of Juneteenth and how it fits into the course on American and Nevada politics. Juneteenth is really a celebration of that day in 1865, June 19th, when American U.S. troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and informed black slaves in that part of the country that they were free as per the Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln had issued during the Civil War. Because right until that information was communicated to them, long after the proclamation had been issued, until it was communicated to them, they just didn't know, right? Because you didn't have the free flow of information back then. So this was right. This would have been the very tail end of the Civil War. So a couple things about that. All right, one, what about the Emancipation Proclamation? What's the deal? That was a wartime executive order issued by President Lincoln as a way basically to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union in efforts by the U.S. Army to overcome the secessionists in southern states. All right, it was a wartime order that said that I hereby declare that all slaves living in states that are in rebellion, i.e. the Confederacy, you are now going forward free. The irony of that, right, and the limit to that substantively was that the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, right, the U.S. government didn't have jurisdiction over that geography. So they weren't really able to enforce that order, right? It was more symbol than substance. Important symbol, but more symbol than substance. Right? The hope was that as this information got communicated to black slaves in the South, that they would free themselves. And some did. Many did not. Because it was risky, right? Unless they could get across lines into northern states. And notably, right, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free those slaves that were in the states that were not in rebellion. Because there were some border states, right? Like I know for sure Indiana, where you still had slaves, but Indiana remained loyal to the Union. So the slaves in Indiana were not free as a result of the proclamation. So again, right, the limits to that proclamation as an executive order during a war. It applied in areas where the U.S. government did not have jurisdiction. And it didn't apply where the U.S. government did have jurisdiction. It was a way to essentially reward the states that remained loyal to the Union but had slavery, and to punish those states that had departed the Union and had slaves. It would have been all of them that left the Confederacy. All right, so now, that being said, look, symbols matter to humans, right? We are a symbolic species. So what this indicated, and it was another example of the brilliance of President Lincoln, right? He was indicating at that point, partway through the Civil War, that this is what it's about. It's about the abolition of slavery. We cannot remain half slave and half free. We must be all one or all the other. And clearly, right, we were not going to be all slave, so we had to be all free. He let people, reach that conclusion on their own. The logic was, unavoidable. So he was indicating this is what the war is about. It's about the eradication of slavery once we pull the Confederacy back into the Union. Right? He was anticipating the 13th Amendment. So in that sense, a very important executive order. Now, all of that being said, right? So Juneteenth, celebration, the end of slavery in the Confederacy and in the Union. Ultimately backed up by the 13th Amendment, encoding that into enduring constitutional law and not just an executive order. Again, right, that's one of the reasons Nevada got admitted to a state quickly, was that the U.S. realized we're going to need as many Republican states as possible to get the work of Reconstruction done. And Nevada was going to be Republican and supportive of Lincoln and his agenda, and the agenda of the radical Republicans in Congress. Radical in the best sense of that term, right? Radically committed to the abolition of slavery. Now, what we know, right, is that Reconstruction lasted for about 12 years. A critical role here was played by President Ulysses S. Grant, who takes a lot of crap for having a corrupt administration during his 8 years as president, the war hero. He did have a corrupt administration. He himself was never corrupt. He's an interesting figure, by the way. I recommend you read a biography of Ulysses S. Grant, a remarkable figure, a tragic figure in some ways. But remember, corruption was rife in American politics at this time. It was everywhere. It was essentially unavoidable. So to say that he had a corrupt administration is like a truism. Well, obviously, that was unavoidable. He wasn't corrupt, but he allowed corruption to fester and perhaps didn't do enough to limit it. But the forces back then of corruption were so powerful. Because this is right when we have the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the big railroads, big finance, big manufacturing. And these become centers of private power that we'd never had before, right? Concentrated capital, concentrated wealth. And they demanded not just a place at the table of politics, but they demanded center stage. And they were going to drive our politics unrestrained by federal regulations, which didn't happen until, right, really, the 1930s with the New Deal. Right? So there's this interregnum, this interim period, where they become dominant forces shaping our politics. Naked private power to benefit private power through our political system, including the Grant administration. So that, we call him on that, but we put it in context. And we also say, you know what else he did? He used the United States Army to enforce Reconstruction in the South. Because that's what it took, right? The South lost the war, the Civil War, but they fought a rearguard action to overturn the results of that war by attempting to reestablish slavery and subjugate black people all over again. Ulysses S. Grant fought the good fight for his time in office. I mean, the radical Republicans fought it initially, right, because Lincoln was assassinated at the beginning of the second term. His lamentable vice president becomes president, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner. Right? Lincoln had chosen him to serve as his VP because he was the only Southern senator who did not leave the Senate when the Confederacy seceded from the Union. Right? So he saw him as a reasonable Southerner who was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican, back when the Republican Party was progressive and the Democratic Party was conservative. And he wanted to, reach out an olive branch to the South. So he chose Johnson as his VP. Right? It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it turned out to be a terrible idea once Lincoln was assassinated. Because who becomes president? Johnson. What was Johnson at the end of the day? Fiercely tribalistic and loyal to the white South. So he tried to undercut Reconstruction. Right? And radical Republicans in Congress were not having it. So they impeached his ass. And he was nearly convicted at trial in the Senate. Did he commit high crimes and misdemeanors? No. No. But impeachment has always been and will always be a political process and not so much a legal process. Don't kid yourselves. Right? Now, look, I'm all for the impeachment of Johnson. He deserved it because, right, he's undercutting Reconstruction. All the blood and treasure we sacrificed for that were being wasted by Johnson. So I say, yay, radical Republicans, impeach that guy. And they did, right? The impeachment is the formal accusation in the House. Then you go to Senate trial and you need 2/3. And they came up one vote shy of 2/3. So Johnson remained in office barely. But after that, he took a step back and realized the radical Republicans are too aggressive, too angry. I'm going to defer to them and let them enact Reconstruction. So initially it was the radical Republicans in Congress who pressed Reconstruction in a good way, and then it was Ulysses S. Grant. And remember, Grant was a war hero. By the way, he was a war hero in the Mexican-American War, where he made his bones, and then, of course, the war hero of the Civil War. A hell of a general. Now, better than Robert E. Lee. Myth to the contrary. There's a lot of mythical bullshit about Robert E. Lee as some romantic figure. Bullshit. He was trash. Trash. So, right, Grant is more than willing to use the military to enforce Reconstruction in the South because he was a military man through and through. And that's what it took, I am sad to say, to enforce the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and additional federal civil rights laws passed by radical Republicans in Congress. That's what it took. But once he left office, right, at the end of his second term, and Rutherford B. Hayes has got next, right, Republican, but not a progressive Republican, not a radical Republican. Rutherford B. Hayes is more interested in establishing a good relationship with this emerging corporate America. And he's not that interested in black people. So he lets construction fall by the wayside. Reconstruction collapses in 1877, once Hayes is president. He pulls the U.S. military out of the South, and Reconstruction collapses. And all of that progress goes away. In many ways, the South, with the North giving up, right? The white South is able to reimpose various forms of slavery through sharecropping as an economic system that was essentially slavery. Look it up, Google it. Sharecropping. And, right, the criminal justice system. What does the 13th Amendment provide? No forced labor except in the case of the criminal justice system. And what did that allow the white South to do? Right? To basically make being a black man in particular, to make that a crime, essentially. And then, right, incarcerate black men in huge numbers after the federal troops left. Incarcerate black men in massive numbers and then put them into forced labor, chain gangs. Looks a lot like slavery. Sharecropping, if you look it up, looks a lot like slavery. And then other things, right, like the KKK to enforce white supremacy. Deprivation of voting rights, violation of the 15th Amendment. No equal protection of the law, violation of the 14th Amendment. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in some ways fall by the wayside, tragically, by 1877. Right. It turns out we have to play a long game on this because we don't revisit that right in a serious way until the 1950s and the 1960s with what's called America's second Reconstruction, right, the Black Civil Rights Movement. So that's the story of Juneteenth, long version, all right? So again, happy holiday. There's much to celebrate, but let's not, let's be aware of the historical context of Juneteenth. It was a promise that was made, enforced for a while, and then a promise broken. And we don't revisit that, right, until the 1950s and the 1960s. And arguably, even today, right, probably, arguably, I think, work to be done on that issue. Thanks all. Take care.